Yesterday, we achieved a total reset with China. After productive talks in Geneva, we made a great deal with China, great trade deal.
The world's two largest economies have taken a step towards trade peace. The United States and China have agreed to reduce the tariffs imposed on each other and call a 90-day truce as they continue negotiations to reach a deal. The CBC's Erin joins me now from Washington. Erin, it's difficult to keep up with U.S. trade policy and tariff policy. So what exactly did the U.S. and China agree to, and why did they agree to it now?
Yeah, I think the president might have been getting ahead of himself a little bit there, too. I'm not sure this is a deal. If we keep it in the context, you're right, of this being a trade war between the planet's two largest economies, this is a truce, right? This is a truce with maybe an eye towards proper peace. Both sides have agreed to, dramatically reduce the tariffs they've imposed on each other for 90 days while they try to get to a proper deal, the one the president's, I guess, already announcing. So I think as far as the second part of that question, the reason for this now is I think both sides need a deal here, right? These tariffs, they're devastating to Chinese exports. We're already seeing year-over-year declines of like 20% for exports into the U.S. from China. But they're also really hard on U.S. consumers and small businesses. They're all dealing with rising prices, right? So it's a really dramatic shift in tone in this trade dispute from both sides.
The consensus from both delegations this weekend is neither side wants a decoupling. And what had occurred with these very high tariffs, as Ambassador Greer said, was the equivalent of an embargo, and neither side wants that. We do want trade. We want more balanced trade, and I think that both sides are committed to achieving that.
So to my ears, David, I think you can really hear in that clip, a consensus that this trade war needs to wind down for the sake of both countries' economies.
Yeah, when container ships are coming back with empty containers from China and there's no inputs to go into American factories, you may have gone a bit too far. So that's the latest on trade. The president is also off to the Middle East. So what's on the agenda there?
Yeah, you mentioned hard to keep up, and it is hard to keep up. But yeah, this is a 4-day trip to the Middle East. It's the president's first major trip abroad in this second term. We know he's hoping to make some economic deals with Gulf countries. We also know he's going to be wading into two of the biggest conflicts on the planet. So the U.S. secured the release of the last American hostage being held by Hamas today, a deal that it largely left Israel out of the equation, a country the president's notably going to skip on this trip, despite Trump really pushing for peace in that conflict. And that's not the only peace process underway in the region. Ukraine and Russia are set to meet in Turkey on Thursday. And the president, he hinted today that he may, pop by. Not sure if he's actually going to do that, but he sort of floated that idea. So it's a really busy few days for the president.
We'll be heading there, and we'll be seeing 3 primary countries. You know all about that: Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar. On Thursday's meeting with Russia and Ukraine is very important. I was very insistent that meeting take place. I think good things can come out of that meeting.
David, one final note, I should say, the president's trip to the Middle East already coming under scrutiny for a gift that apparently was to be given by Qatar. That country reportedly offering to give the president a luxury jet with $400 million to be used as, I guess, the new Air Force One. Trump blasting critics of the gift as world-class idiots.
All right, there you go. Foreign country just allowed to give the president a plane, apparently, in his view. Erin, thank you so much. That's the CBC's Erin Collins in Washington. Okay, so we've got the United States and China. They reach a trade war truce. U.S. President Donald Trump is calling the deal a win, but is this the total reset of U.S.-China relations that President Trump claims? Well, we've got Vina Nadjibulla. She's the Vice President of Research and Strategy at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. She's here now. It's good to see you in the studio, Vina. Good to have you here.
Great to see you in person as well. Thank
What
you.
do you make of this? Why now? I mean, Trump has said he would never lower the tariffs, without concessions from China, but here we are.
Well, first of all, it's not a reset. Obviously, the messaging from both sides is, I think, overly optimistic. It is a temporary truce, and it's one that was necessary because the pain point was just too high. I mean, I think the two sides with these escalatory tariffs of April went so far that it was essentially a trade embargo, and the U.S. and China still need to trade with each other. Now, there are many other strategic concerns in terms of risks, and the agenda of de-risking continues. So this is not sort of a trade deal and a complete reset. But they needed to de-escalate, and they've done so. Now there's a long process ahead, possibly many months or even years, to actually arrive at a deal.
You know, there's a lot of strategic considerations, but is there strategy here? I mean, you know, if you set a tariff rate sort of impulsively, which is the way this looks, and you effectively create an embargo to the point that ships are coming into the port of LA with nothing in them, I mean, that is not a strategic outcome.
Well, one has to separate what President Trump and his team are doing as part of the rollout and the execution of what they're doing, and the kind of the potential for strategy to be there. Meaning that there is an interest in rebalancing trade with China, in rebalancing relations writ large, in making China more responsive to the various concerns that the U.S. has had on overcapacity and everything else. So that's in place. But then I think what we saw since April was just this escalatory ladder that they went up to and then needed to find an off-ramp. So essentially President Trump overplayed this particular hand of cards and had to fold, but the game is continuing.
So can he still get to, I guess, the strategic outcome he was hoping for, even if it was this chaotic, winding path to get there? Because they are going to do some sort of a reset, it seems. I mean,
yes.
What's your set of
Well, there's
expectations?
obviously credibility issues, so this really did damage, but together with everything else that has happened since April 2nd, Liberation Day announcements, right? So we've seen a lot of this kind of off-ramps that are now being found through these negotiations. But the real question is, can he achieve certain objectives like reshoring or onshoring some manufacturing, right? Like with these tariffs that are still in place, and we have to remind our viewers that we still have a baseline that's now around 30% on most goods, and for some it's 45 to 55, right? So we haven't gone back to kind of tariffs that we saw even back in February, right? So this still is a really high level, which will put pressure on some supply chain rerouting, and it would also put pressure on China to potentially rebalance their domestic economy and focus more on consumption rather than manufacturing and export-led growth, which is not only a problem for the US and even Canada, but also Brazil and India and other places which don't want to lose all of their industrial base and manufacturing, right? And just buy stuff from China. So I think the real questions are, what would the negotiation look like moving forward? And to what extent US is able to meet those objectives? And to what extent this will also play into negotiations with others, right? Because with the US essentially now engaging in these bilateral negotiations, with the UK being the first one, but Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, Indonesia are next in line. How will China and this sort of policy towards China play into what the U.S. is doing with others?
Right.
That's a big question.
Yeah, and the UK agreement is very narrow in scope. It's nowhere near a comprehensive trade deal. And you look at what he's trying to do with the reshoring of manufacturing. It is unclear to me and a lot of people whether the U.S. even has the labor pool to do that with the desire to work in some of those jobs. But here we are, right? So you can see how, with costs potentially going up and the labor market slowing down, why Trump would want to do something, and because he's got midterms. China doesn't have midterms.
Yes.
What does this tell us about what domestic pressure President Xi was facing in China that he would agree to a pause like this?
Well, China is in a much weaker economic position in many ways, right? Like in the U.S., you mentioned all of those pressure points, but the U.S. went into all of this in a much stronger position economically in terms of its growth numbers. Now, U.S. is doing everything possible to change that picture right now, and sort of a lot of policies that are harming that. But in the case of China, unemployment was going to be a serious issue. So we're talking about these empty container ships that are coming to the U.S. and potential price issues and empty shelves in the U.S. But for China, that means labor issues, right? So they already have a high unemployment. It also, obviously, their growth was already sluggish, so they can't afford this kind of external environment because even though, obviously, U.S. is one market for them, there were going to be pressures on others as well, because if China can't export to the U.S., which is what 145% tariff basically meant, they were trying to redirect export elsewhere to European Union, to Latin America, Africa, and that was starting to create tensions in those relationships as well. At a time when China is on a charm offensive, trying to take advantage of this U.S. sort of disruption and abandoning of its leadership. So for China, I think it was important to find a new kind of bottom basically in the relationship and to begin a conversation to try to save some of that economic relations with the U.S., but also to buy time to solidify its position with others.
Right, and you know, the pressure it creates, I mean, Canada is not directly affected by this, but, you know, when the two biggest economies in the world are going to war, you're in the collateral damage wave, and Canada's already been hit with tariffs on canola,
Yes.
canola meal, peas, 25% on pork and seafood products, for getting into alignment with the United States on electric vehicle tariffs, right,
Yes.
under the Biden administration. So does this shift between the U.S. and China, should we look at that and see there's hope potentially? Because I don't know if the EV tariffs in the U.S. will necessarily go away, and Canada might not want to get offside with Trump on this one.
So the EV tariffs are still in place, the 100% tariffs, and a number of other sectoral tariffs are still in place, and more sectoral tariffs are likely to come, right? So
Right.
for Canada, I think basically the big point here is that whereas before we relied on alignment with the Biden administration strategy on China, because we could, it made sense to us, now we have to have a made in Canada China strategy. We have to look at what's in our interests. How do we begin dialogue with China, which the Chinese are saying now they're very open to have dialogue with Prime Minister Carney and his new government. So through that dialogue, figuring out how do we reduce the tariffs on canola and seafood products, but do it in a way that doesn't damage other parts of our overall relationship, right? So it's like, yes, engage with China on this, but keep in mind that the national security issues, foreign interference, transnational repression,
Right.
economic security concerns, all are still there, right? So China did not change just because our relations with the US are now much more difficult. So we need to have a new approach. This gives us some time, I think. Basically, what we're seeing from the news today, as well as the deal with the UK, which was not broad, but it did have stuff around economic security and China, right? So on steel and aluminum, I think that's going to be also the case for Canada. There will be pressure for us to stay aligned with the US. But we need to take that much more sort of strategically now. Before, yes, align fully. Now it's what's in Canada's interests. How do we secure both our economic interests, but also make sure that we don't compromise on national security and other priorities?
How do you balance that, though? Like, we've got a new cabinet coming in tomorrow, and we don't know who's going to be industry, trade, foreign affairs, all of these things. But Trump is going to take up so much bandwidth,
Yes.
right? Because the shock is so immediate when he does something because of the, you know, the interconnectedness of the economies. How do you strike that balance, you know, with re-engaging with China in a way, but not poking the bear, you know, south of the
Yeah.
border? That's
Yeah, no,
balancing act.
listen, it's not easy. It's a really good question, and I'm glad smarter people than me will be in cabinet and they'll have to be answering that question. But I think the bottom line is we have to do multiple hard things at the same time. It's not easy, but we have to do it. That's the only way to make it out of this. But one reminder, Canada is in a much better position than many of our allies with China. It's only 7.6% of our trade, right? Like, we're not as dependent,
Yeah,
and
the
it's
exposure's
vulnerable.
limited,
The
right.
exposure is limited, so I think we have a good hand, and we have to diversify away both from China and reduce our reliance from the US at the same time by building partnerships with others, ASEAN, Japan, Korea, Australia, even India. I think I can come back to talk about India, but I think that relationship is much easier than China.
Yeah, a lot of countries who are now getting closer to China because of the U.S. tariffs. Well, look, Vina, I don't know who's going to go into cabinet. I don't know if they're smarter than you, but they're a heck of a lot smarter than me. That's Vina Nadjibulla, Vice President, Research and Strategy at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. Good to see you. Thanks for coming.
Good to see you too. Thank you.